In the second video, we're going to look at disruptions to ecosystems that are going to result in changes to either the structure or the dynamics within that ecosystem. So we can break that into two groups, either human activities or geologic, natural, meteorologic activities, both of which can lead to different disruptions. And some examples of those human activities you can see there, things like climate change or introduced species, the introduction of new diseases, deforestation, urbanization, which cause habitat changes. Habitat change also comes through climate change, and farming practices. Also, there's farming practices that impact ecosystems through, for example, fertilizer runoff, or that's supposed to be monocropping, which means just not rotating crops, but having the same crop planted over and over again, which results in a depletion of nutrients in the soil. And things that are geologic or meteorologic are things like changing weather patterns or the drifting of continents. If we're looking over time, we can look at extinction events such as meteor impacts. So some more examples of human impact. So we talked a little bit about agricultural practices. So the cycling of nutrients, we know, involves that producer level. So when we're talking about agriculture and human control of agriculture, we're going to see a lot of control over what happens in an ecosystem. So for example, the use or misuse of fertilizer can greatly impact nutrient cycling and the geochemical cycling of things like nitrogen and phosphorus. We also have the human impact of acid precipitation, which is a direct result of the industrialization of our planet. We have the introduction of different toxins to the environment. So that concept that we'll quickly go over, a biologic magnification. Along with acid precipitation, in terms of our impact on the environment, we also have global warming, which is a direct result of greenhouse gases and the effect that we're having there. And also in terms of our atmosphere, we have the depletion of our ozone. So these are all very closely related things, and the rising levels of carbon dioxide within our atmosphere. So let's take a look at some of these individually. We're going to start with climate change. So climate change can impact an environment even at the producer level. So we can see that net primary production has increased in terrestrial ecosystems from 1982 to 1999. And that's primarily due to decreased cloud cover over tropical forests. So what that means is those tropical forests are getting more sunlight. And so we can see that as climate change has occurred, there actually has been an increase in net primary productivity. So it's not always going to be entirely a negative impact. But what we do see also tied along with this change in climate, we can see those gains in the net primary productivity being counteracted by things like droughts, so a decrease in availability of water, particularly in the southern hemisphere. But we see that here in North America as well. And as we see heat increasing, we get what are called hot droughts, which lead to forest fires and infestations. So your book talks about bark beetle, and so look at that as an example of an infestation that is actually a result of a change in climate and increasing temperatures. So this climate change, in terms of that water availability, is really the interference that is occurring as humans are responsible for climate change. We see a breakdown in the water cycle. So one of the ways that occurs is not only through increased temperatures. And so we see that if you just listen to the news and kind of look at it over the period of a year, you hear these crazy hurricanes or the increase in hurricanes or just crazy storms that occur. Or in California here, we have droughts, the lack of rain. So we have this disruption to what has been a reliable water cycle um, um, due to simple increase in carbon dioxide and that having an effect on increasing the overall climate of the biosphere. But another way we have a human impact is by habitat change. So when we have deforestation occurring, that also interferes with the water cycle because what we have, we remember that plants are responsible for the transpiration of water. So they bring water up from the soil, up through the leaves, and then it evaporates from the leaves. And so if you wipe out a forest, you take away large trees that are responsible for transpiration. And so we are interfering. We have a block right in the middle of that transfer of water from the soil back up to the atmosphere. So when that occurs, we have less water in the atmosphere, which means we're going to end up with less rain, less precipitation. Okay, getting to the right slide here. So the effects of deforestation also interfere with and disrupt the water cycle because it increases runoff. So when you wipe out a forest, for example, you can see in this lower graph down there between 1965 and 66, they had deforestation occurring. The increase in water runoff can be as much as 40%. And in the case of this graph, it's showing that along with that water runoff, you also are losing some of the key nutrients in the ecosystem. So in this case, nitrogen is being lost in the form of nitrate, with that red line showing the actual runoff amounts of nitrogen in surface water, and then the overall loss down here of the amount of nitrogen in this ecosystem. So the effects, again, of deforestation is not only loss of water, but also of nutrients. So another thing we want to look at is the effect on the carbon cycle. So climate change and other human activities can also affect whether an ecosystem is storing or losing carbon over time. So if an ecosystem is storing carbon, then it's called a carbon sink. If it's losing it, it's a carbon source. And we can actually tie that to the production level that's occurring. So the net ecosystem productivity, so the producers, how active they are, is going to determine whether an ecosystem is actually a sink or a source. So if it's a sink, that means it would have a net ecosystem productivity number that's greater than 0, so a positive number. And if it has a negative net ecosystem productivity, then the ecosystem actually is releasing more carbon dioxide than actually storing it. And so that makes sense. So for example, if you have deforestation occurring, then you're going to have fewer organisms going through photosynthesis, fixing carbon dioxide and storing it within the mass and then putting it into that food chain. So if you are, for example, again, in the process of wiping out a forest through deforestation, then you may in turn be taking that ecosystem from a sink into a source. So what we have in response to all this is what's called restoration ecology. And so restoration ecologists seek to take degraded ecosystems and put them back to their natural state. So given enough time, biological communities can actually recover on their own. But restoration ecologists actually employ a few different methods to help speed up that process. And the two that we're going to look at are bioremediation and biological augmentation of ecosystems. So the first one, bioremediation, is using organisms, most often they're bacteria, prokaryotes, or fungi or plants, to detoxify an ecosystem. So if an ecosystem, for example, has some sort of toxin that has disrupted it in some way, then the introduction of, for example, some microbes to that system can help remediate it back to recovery. And these organisms specifically take up, sometimes they're actually metabolizing the toxins themselves. So an example of this is this bacteria that can metabolize uranium and other elements from an insoluble form into one that is less likely to leach into streams and groundwater. This is an example from Campbell's textbook where they have actually did a test with these uranium-filled pits. And what they did was introduce actually what was already present was this Shigella onidensis bacteria, which is able to convert uranium and nitrogen into an insoluble form. So they were already present in these pits. And what they did is they added ethanol, which is a food source for these bacteria. And as they added more ethanol, what they found is that that stimulated the growth of the bacteria. And then that in turn decreased the concentration of soluble uranium. So again, this is an example of bioremediation. The other type of restoration ecology is biological augmentation. And this again is going to be using organisms, but in this case, it's using organisms. To augment means to add to. So these organisms are used to add essential materials to an ecosystem that has lost essential nutrients. So, for example, nitrogen-fixing plants can increase the available nitrogen that, for example, was involved in runoff due to deforestation. So if you were to plant these nitrogen-fixing plants, that would help increase available nitrogen in that ecosystem. Also, you could add this mycorrhizal fungi to help plants get the nutrients that are already present in the soil, so enable them to do that. There are actual companies like this one here where you can add microbes to an aquatic ecosystem in order to get it to have the correct nutrients to have a balanced ecosystem. So there are actually companies that will come out and look at a water source and add the appropriate organisms to it to get it to a healthy ecosystem, a balanced state. The other type of biology now, so that was restoration biology. We also have conservation biology, which seeks to maintain the levels of biodiversity. So we have 3 levels of biodiversity: genetic, species, and ecosystem. And so conservation biology can focus on different aspects of that. So for example, we have the genetic diversity here of a vole population. So we're looking at, these are the different chromosomes available there. And we know from our previous units why that's so important. We can have species diversity in a coastal redwood ecosystem here, or community and ecosystem diversity across the landscape of an entire region. So an example of this, so the extinction of a population, for example, would reduce the genetic diversity required for microevolution within a species. Or an endangered species is one that would be in danger of extinction through its range would decrease species diversity. The definition of a threatened species is one that is likely to become endangered, which again would threaten the species diversity and also the community and ecosystem diversity. So let's go on here. So again, looking at ways that this occurs is through these human activities and geologic and meteorologic activities. So let's take a look at some of those activities in more detail and define them. So one of them is invasive species. So by definition, an invasive species is one that's not native to an area. So humans are involved in this activity simply by moving a species from one native location to a new location, either intentionally or by accident. And these species become invasive once they're introduced when they don't have any natural predators in that new environment, or parasites or pathogens. And that allows them to outcompete native organisms for resources and spread rapidly. So an example, this is an example of kudzu, which is a plant that was actually introduced by humans as an attempt to control erosion in the South. And what they found is because it didn't have any natural parasites or herbivores or pathogens, it quickly spread like crazy and overtook entire ecosystems. Okay, go back here. So looking again at human actions that impact ecosystems, we have this idea of nutrient enrichment. And you guys would probably know that better as eutrophication being the result. So nutrient enrichment, under that category, we have these ideas that nutrients can be removed from one part of the biosphere and added to another, for example, through harvesting. Or we get the depletion of nutrients in the soil due to agriculture. Or we have the enrichment of the soil through the use of fertilizers, like adding nitrogen and phosphorus and fertilizers to an ecosystem, and again resulting in things like eutrophication. Critical load is a term that I want you to understand the definition of. It's the amount of added nutrient that can be absorbed by plants without damaging the ecosystem's integrity. So an example of that would be how much nitrogen can you add to a particular ecosystem before you get so much runoff that it ends up in a local body of water, causing an algal bloom that then in turn causes the death of that aquatic ecosystem through the eutrophication of that system. So that critical load is that amount, the actual physical amount of the nitrogen and phosphorus that could be applied to a field, for example. Another human activity is the result of the accumulation of toxins. So as human activity releases toxins into the environment, into ecosystems, we have this biological magnification possibility, which is the idea that toxins get more and more concentrated the higher up we get in the food chain. We also have climate change and ozone depletion, which we'll take a look at in just a minute. So biomagnification, again, is this idea as you move up a food chain. So we start here with these krill, and then they're eaten by the salmon, the pollock, the oyster, and then the tuna eat those, and then the shark eats those, or the pike or the albacore. So we have this idea basically of this pyramid. And as you move up the pyramid or move through this food chain, what we see is an increased amount of mercury being found at that different trophic level. And that's the magnification of the toxin of mercury. And that mercury is the result of human activities, like industrial release of mercury or the mining of mercury. And it ends up in aquatic systems. Natural, so looking at the geologic impact here, volcanoes can also release mercury. So this would be a naturally occurring geologic impact on an ecosystem that results in the biomagnification of a toxin. Oops. So now I want to focus a little bit on climate change. So climate change is the result of the release of gaseous waste products into the atmosphere through human activities like driving cars. And that drives climate change. The driving of cars that are fossil fuel burners causes the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide to increase. So life on Earth is protected from the damaging effects of ultraviolet radiation by the protective layer of ozone molecules in the atmosphere. And all of these different molecules, including carbon dioxide, are able to act as a greenhouse roof for the entire globe. And so if you think of our biosphere as a large greenhouse, where we have nice living conditions because there's enough heat to allow life to go on, and particularly for the primary producers to be able to do photosynthesis using the light energy and the heat through a transparent surface in the roof that allows light energy to pass through, but contains enough heat to keep the chemical processes going. So that's our greenhouse, our Earth as a greenhouse. So this idea of a greenhouse effect is also a bit of a problem for us. As we've had an increase in carbon dioxide and also other greenhouse gases such as nitrogen, the gaseous form of nitrogen in the atmosphere, because as we have an increase in these greenhouse gases, they're actually able to trap more and more heat. And that heat then is trapped in that upper layer that we see here, this ceiling of our greenhouse here, and reflected back to Earth. And so as that occurs, as we get more and more heat being reflected back to Earth, we're seeing an actual temperature rise occur. So that is definitely a problem. So this increasing concentration of greenhouse gases has caused the average global temperature to increase by almost a full degree Celsius since the 1900s. And an additional rise of at least 3 degrees Celsius is predicted by the end of the next century. Also, what we see occurring is an ozone depletion, which causes DNA damage in plants and phytoplankton, and increases the rate of skin cancer and cataracts in humans. So and that's also related to this idea, this ozone is part of this upper layer that is above our greenhouse ceiling of our planet. So we'll talk about the ozone depletion in a minute, but let's concentrate right now on this increase in temperature. So you can see in this graph the years 1960 to 2015, and what's measured on this side is the carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million, and you can just see a completely steady rise in that. In carbon dioxide is that blue line. And then on this side we also see a correlation of temperature increase over that same time period, and how that increase is following a very close correlation to the carbon dioxide increase. And from 1960, for example, if we just take an average temperature of 13.9, we can see by 2015 we're already up to 14.5 to 14.6 degrees Celsius. So that's a significant temperature rise that is correlated in a fairly short amount of time. So what happens with this increasing temperature in terms of impacting ecosystems is that we have a change occurring, modification to different populations' habitats. We have a decrease in the geographic range of populations within those ecosystems. Those populations are forced to migrate, leave. If they don't, some of them become extinct, or they see significant decreases in their numbers. We have a reduction in available water occurring in different ecosystems, and all of this can lead to natural disasters like we've seen so commonly in California with rampant fires. But also in other parts of the United States and around the world, we see other natural disasters like crazy, unusual storms that cause more habitat destruction and impact on ecosystems and on life. This is a summary of different types of effects from climate change. So you can see here, ranging from aquatic to terrestrial ecosystems, we have everything from acidification of an aquatic ecosystem to thermal stress on different populations within that ecosystem. Thermal stress means increasing temperatures are causing problems for the organisms. And then if we look over here at terrestrial, everything from erosion of soils to fires to the functioning of stomata on plants. All of these things are impacted by an increase in temperature. And if we think back to every unit we've studied, starting with biochemistry and the action of enzymes in their reaction to changes in temperature, we can see even at the very elemental and molecular level, an increase in temperature can have drastic effects and significant effects. And as we look at every level of organization of an ecosystem from that cellular up to the entire globe, we can study the impact of an increased temperature. So this is a nice summary looking at how ecosystem function. And if we again are thinking about the health of an ecosystem based on its diversity and its productivity and the sequestration of carbon, which means the storing of carbon within that primary production and also different trophic levels within the organisms. Sequestering carbon as a sink is a function of the health of an ecosystem. And the interaction of this and the impact of these other things here are going to cause whether this is occurring or not. So we have the structure of vegetation, whether we have a lot of biodiversity at that producer level, or if we have that being impacted through different human activities. We have either the impact of humans in terms of emitting more carbon into the atmosphere, so releasing carbon rather than keeping it sequestered. Or we have the opposite. We have the restoration of ecosystems occurring through human impact. And then, of course, overriding all of this is the result of climate change. So either the warming effects on the planet or the actual change in precipitation, either the increase or the decrease of precipitation around the globe. So all of those things are how climate change can have a disruptive or a disruptive effect on ecosystems. Okay, so our final concept is a look at the ozone. So the ozone is the layer at the very upper part of our atmosphere around our biosphere that acts as a protection. It's a layer of chemicals, gaseous chemicals, that actually protects living organisms from some of the waves of sunlight that are coming through our atmosphere. So we know the spectrum of sunlight includes visible light, some of which plants are using for their production, but we also have the invisible light, and some of that light is actually quite damaging. So UV light is some of those wavelengths that it can actually cause problems for living organisms. It's destructive to on the cellular level. And so the ozone layer protects living organisms by blocking out UV radiation from the sun. So we know that there have been human practices that have released chemical compounds, especially those that include chlorine or bromine, both from industry and also from things like aerosols. So we know, like, for example, hairsprays that are kept in aerosol cans, when they're used, release some of these chemical compounds that, as they accumulate in the upper atmosphere, have actually caused holes in our ozone layer. And those holes then let in UV radiation, which has its destructive effects on living organisms. But because this was noticed and realized actually in the 60s, it came to the notice of scientists, and there were policies implemented around the globe to start decreasing the release of these damaging chemical compounds that destroy the ozone layer. And so now the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, is actually estimating that because of the changes in policy around the world, that by 2065, the ozone layer could be fully restored. So this is a nice way to end this lecture, to look at how conservation and restoration biology can actually have an effect, and it can range in effect from educating humans to change activities to actually changing governmental policies around the world. So it's not just going in and doing bioaugmentation or bioremediation. It can be political, it can be educational, but it does come down to the role of human activity on the biosphere. So we'll end our lecture with that, and hope that this is helpful to you all. And that is the end of our unit on ecology as well.